Before a single calorie enters your mouth, the smell of cooking food has already changed your body. Gastric acid secretion has begun. The parietal cells in your stomach lining producing hydrochloric acid in response to a signal that originated not in the stomach but in the nose. Pancreatic enzymes are mobilizing. The acinar cells of the pancreas packaging digestive enzymes into vesicles and moving them toward the pancreatic duct. Bile is flowing, the gallbladder contracting, releasing the emulsifying fluid the liver produced, delivering it to the duodenum where fat digestion will occur. Insulin has been pre-secreted in a small anticipatory pulse, the beta cells of the pancreas responding to a vagal signal by releasing just enough insulin to begin priming the glucose clearance machinery in advance of glucose that has not yet arrived in the blood. Your vagus nerve initiated all of it. The trigger was not food in the stomach. The trigger was volatile molecules in the air, aromatic compounds released by heat, carried by diffusion from the cooking pot to the nasal cavity, binding to olfactory receptors that sent a signal through the olfactory bulb to the brainstem, and from the brainstem to every organ in the digestive tract simultaneously. Pavlov documented this in 1910 and called it the cephalic phase, the head-driven preparation of the gut for incoming food. Your digestive system does not wait for food to arrive. It prepares for food based on smell, and the preparation requires sustained olfactory input, 15 to 20 minutes of continuous smell exposure to reach full secretory readiness. A microwave meal provides 30 seconds of aroma. A slow-cooked meal provides 2 hours. You have felt the difference, even if you never named the mechanism. You have walked into a house where food has been cooking for hours and felt something shift in your body before you saw the food, before you tasted anything, before you sat down. Saliva flooded the mouth. The stomach produced a sensation that was not quite hunger but readiness, a physical opening, a sense that the digestive system had already begun working. The house smelled like food and the body responded as though food had already arrived. You attributed it to appetite, or to anticipation, or to the pleasure of a home-cooked meal. The mechanism was vagal, the olfactory vagal pathway running a preparation protocol through the brainstem, priming every organ in the digestive tract for food the nose had detected but the mouth had not yet received. Person who microwaves a meal and eats immediately does not feel this. The food arrives at an unprepared stomach. The acid is not pre-secreted, the enzymes are not mobilized, the bile is not flowing, the insulin has not pre-pulsed. Every digestive process must start from cold, reactive, rather than preparatory. The food arriving before the system that processes it has been activated. The difference between the two experiences, the slow-cooked meal that the body was ready for and the microwave meal that the body was not, is not psychological preference. It is the difference between a digestive system that received 2 hours of vagal preparation and one that received none. Think about what Pavlov actually discovered, because the finding is more radical than the popular version suggests, and the mechanism it revealed has been operating in your kitchen for longer than you realize. In 1910, Pavlov demonstrated in dogs that the sight and smell of food triggered gastric secretion before any food entered the digestive tract. The popular version of this, Pavlov rang a bell, the dog salivated, reduces the finding to a conditioning story. The actual finding was physiological, and it was vagal. Sensory input from the nose and the eyes activated the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus nerve, which sent parasympathetic efferent commands to the stomach, the pancreas, the gallbladder, and the small intestine. The entire gastrointestinal tract began preparing for food based on a sensory signal from the head, not from the gut, not from the blood, not from any metabolic indicator of actual food presence. The nose smelled food. The brainstem activated the gut. The preparation was real, measurable, and physiologically consequential. In humans, the cephalic phase accounts for approximately 20 to 30% of total gastric acid secretion for a given meal, acid produced before the first bite, acid that is ready and waiting in the stomach when food arrives, reducing the time required for initial protein denaturation and pepsin activation. 20 to 30% is substantial, Nearly a third of the acid the stomach will produce for the meal is generated before the meal begins. A meal that arrives at an unprepared stomach. No pre-secreted acid, no pre-released pepsinogen, no advanced motility increase, begins protein digestion. 15 to 20 minutes behind a meal that arrives at a cephalic phase prime stomach. Those 15 to 20 minutes matter disproportionately for the person over 65 because gastric acid production already declines with age. The parietal cells produce less acid per unit of stimulation. The cells are present, but their output per cell decreases as the gastric mucosa thins and the cellular machinery ages. Pepsinogen secretion declines in parallel. The acid output that was abundant at 30, that processed a steak efficiently at 40, that handled a heavy meal without complaint at 50, is diminished at 70. The aging stomach is already starting behind. The cephalic phase is the mechanism that compensates for this decline. It gives the aging stomach a head start, a 15 to 20 minute advanced preparation that partially offsets the reduced acid output. Removing the cephalic phase by eliminating the olfactory preparation, by microwaving, by eating delivery food that arrived without cooking smell, by consuming meals that provided no sustained olfactory signal, removes the head start from a system that already starts behind. The deficit compounds. Bloating, heaviness, the sense that food sits in the stomach longer than it should. Symptoms. The 65-plus viewer reports frequently, may be partly explained by meals that arrive without cephalic preparation. The stomach received the food before the acid was ready. The protein denaturation was delayed. Larger food particles reached the small intestine. The duodenal osmotic load was higher than the prepared intestine expected. The discomfort was not caused by the food. It was caused by the timing. The food arriving before the digestive system had completed its preparation protocol. Now, why cooking produces smell in the first place? Because the physics of volatilization is what connects the temperature of the cooking pot to the receptor cells in the nose. And the physics explains why slow cooking produces a fundamentally different olfactory signal than fast cooking. Aromatic molecules in food are volatile organic compounds, molecules with low enough molecular weight and high enough vapor pressure to transition from liquid or solid phase to gas phase at cooking temperatures. At room temperature, many of these compounds remain below their vapor pressure threshold. The food smells faintly or not at all. Raw chicken on a cutting board produces minimal aroma. The aromatic compounds are present in the tissue, but they are locked in the liquid and solid phases, unable to escape into the air. Heating raises the temperature above the volatilization threshold. The molecules escape into the gas phase and diffuse into the surrounding air, from high concentration above the cooking pot to low concentration across the kitchen, through the hallway, into the adjacent rooms, up the stairs, following the concentration gradient that Fick's law of diffusion describes. The smell travels. The person in the living room detects it. The person upstairs detects it. The cephalic phase begins in every person in the house who has a functioning olfactory epithelium. The vagal preparation is not limited to the cook. It reaches everyone who can smell the food. But slow cooking does not merely heat food to serving temperature and stop. Slow cooking sustains the temperature in a range where sequential chemical reactions produce new aromatic compounds that did not exist in the raw food. Compounds that are created by the cooking process itself, not merely released by it. You see, and this is where the 2-hour timeline earns its claim. Because slow cooking does not produce one smell. It produces a sequence of smells, and the sequence is what defeats the mechanism that would otherwise shut the cephalic phase down. Mechanism is habituation. The olfactory system habituates to constant smells rapidly. Within minutes, a constant odor fades from awareness because the olfactory neurons reduce their firing rate in response to an unchanging stimulus. A scented candle smells strong when you light it and invisible 20 minutes later. If slow cooking produced one constant aroma, the cephalic phase would habituate and extinguish within minutes. It does not, because slow cooking produces an evolving aromatic signal through sequential chemical reactions that each generate different volatile compounds at different temperatures and different rates. Maillard reaction between amino acids and sugars begins above approximately 140 degrees at the food surface, producing hundreds of volatile compounds that did not exist in the raw food. Caramelization begins above 170 degrees, producing a different set. Fat-soluble compounds released as cooking oils heat produce a third aromatic stream. Each stage sends new molecules to the nose. Each new molecule activates a different combination of the 400 olfactory receptor types in the nasal epithelium. The aromatic profile at minute 10 is different from minute 30, which is different from minute 60. The olfactory system cannot habituate because the stimulus keeps changing, and each change reinforces the vagal preparation signal that habituation would otherwise extinguish. The smell of your mother's kitchen, the specific combination of spices and fat and heat that characterized one house and no other, was a cephalic phase signal. Your body responded to before you were old enough to name any of the foods being prepared. The olfactory limbic pathway stores those aromatic signatures alongside the autobiographical memories they accompany. The reason a particular cooking smell can transport you to a kitchen from 40 years ago is that the olfactory cortex connects directly to the hippocampus and the amygdala. The smell bypasses the cortical processing that other senses require and arrives at the memory and emotion centers without mediation. The cephalic phase was running in that childhood kitchen for every meal your mother cooked. Your body was preparing for food hours before dinner. You never knew. A microwave heats food to serving temperature in 2 to 5 minutes through volumetric dielectric heating. The microwave radiation excites water molecules throughout the food simultaneously, raising the internal temperature by molecular friction rather than by surface conduction. The food gets hot, but the surface does not reach 140 degrees in the way that a pan, an oven wall, or a grill grate would heat it, because the heating is internal and distributed rather than external and surface, concentrated. No Maillard products form because the surface temperature never crosses the Maillard threshold. The food lacks the brown crust, the caramelized edges, the complex surface chemistry that oven roasting and pan cooking produce, and those absent chemical products are the absent aromatic compounds the nose never receives. Minimal volatilization occurs because the food is typically sealed in a container or covered with a lid or film that traps whatever volatile compounds the internal heating does produce. The gases cannot escape into the kitchen air. The container opens at the table. A brief burst of steam carries a few seconds of concentrated aroma, then it dissipates. The microwave meal arrives at the table without the 2-hour olfactory preparation that slow cooking provides. The food is hot, the taste may be adequate, but the cephalic phase never occurred. The stomach receives the food unprepared. The pancreas receives no advance signal. The gallbladder sits at rest. The insulin pre-pulse never fired. The insulin pre-pulse never fired. The meal enters a digestive system that is starting every process from cold. And here is the question the cephalic phase literature does not answer. Because the secretory preparation reaches its maximum in 15 to 20 minutes. If the stomach, pancreas, and gallbladder are fully primed after 20 minutes of olfactory input, what does the remaining 100 minutes of slow cooking provide? Why does a 2-hour cooking session produce a different physiological state at the table than a 20-minute cooking session if the secretory preparation plateaus at 20 minutes? Answer is not secretory, it is autonomic. Vagal activation from continuous olfactory input does not stop at the digestive organs. It establishes and maintains a parasympathetic state, a sustained autonomic bias toward rest and digest that persists for the duration of the olfactory exposure. For 2 hours, the person in the house where food is cooking has their autonomic nervous system biased toward parasympathetic dominance by the continuous olfactory vagal signal. Heart rate is slightly lower. Mesenteric blood flow, the blood supply to the digestive organs, is increased, redirected from the skeletal muscles and the sympathetic dominant vascular beds toward the gut. Cortisol is lower because the parasympathetic bias suppresses the HPA axis activation that sustained sympathetic tone produces. The gut-brain axis is in digestive mode. The enteric nervous system is receiving parasympathetic input that increases motility, increases secretion, and prepares the absorptive surfaces of the small intestine for nutrient uptake. The person who has been smelling food for 2 hours sits down to eat in a parasympathetically primed state. The autonomic nervous system has been biased toward digestive mode for 2 hours. The mesenteric vasculature is dilated and receiving increased blood flow. The gastric motility is elevated. The secretory machinery is at peak output. The person who microwaves a meal and eats immediately sits down in whatever autonomic state they occupied before, which for many people over 65 means sympathetically biased from screen time, from the evening news cycle, from the ambient stress of a day spent indoors without the parasympathetic inputs previous discussions have described. The sympathetically biased person sits down to eat with reduced mesenteric blood flow, blood directed toward the muscles and the brain by the sympathetic state rather than toward the gut. The stomach receives food while operating on reduced blood supply. Acid secretion is suppressed because the parietal cells require blood flow to produce acid. Enzyme secretion is reduced because these center cells require parasympathetic signaling to release their contents. The food arrives. The system is not ready. The system is not even in the right autonomic mode to become ready quickly. That autonomic difference, not just secretory preparation, but sustained parasympathetic bias from continuous olfactory vagal activation, is the dimension the cephalic phase textbooks omit, and the dimension I cannot read past once the anatomy made it visible. The sustained parasympathetic bias across a full cooking session is inferred from the continuous vagal activation the olfactory input provides. Each minute of novel aromatic input reinforces the vagal signal. The specific measurement, autonomic state, at minute 120 of sustained cooking smell versus baseline, has not been performed. The direction is consistent with the anatomy. The duration is inferred rather than confirmed. What is confirmed? The cephalic phase operates through vagal activation. Continuous olfactory input sustains vagal activation, and vagal activation produces parasympathetic bias. The 2-hour extrapolation follows from the anatomy even if the 2-hour measurement has not been made. Well, and the olfactory. Vagal pathway is anatomically specific enough to trace from the nose to the stomach in named structures. Volatile molecules from cooking food enter the nasal cavity during each inhalation and bind to olfactory receptor neurons in the olfactory epithelium. A patch of tissue, approximately 5 square centimeters at the top of each nasal cavity, containing roughly 10 million receptor neurons expressing approximately 400 different receptor types. The binding pattern, which combination of the 400 receptors is activated by a given volatile compound, encodes the specific olfactory identity of the food. Roasting chicken activates a different receptor pattern than baking bread, which activates a different pattern than simmering onions. The olfactory system does not detect food. It detects the specific chemical signature of the specific food being cooked, and the vagal preparation signal is calibrated to the type of food the nose reports. Olfactory signal travels from the olfactory bulb to the olfactory cortex, and simultaneously through collateral projections to the nucleus tractus solitarius. The brainstem integration center, the chest weight discussion described as the convergence point for vagal afferent information. From the NTS, the signal activates the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus, which sends parasympathetic efferent commands to every digestive organ. Stomach, increase acid secretion, increase pepsinogen release, increase motility. Pancreas, begin enzyme secretion, begin the anticipatory insulin pulse. Gallbladder, contract, release stored bile into the duodenum. Small intestine, increase motility, prepare absorptive surfaces. The entire gastrointestinal tract is being primed for food by a signal from the nose. No food tasted, no food swallowed. The digestive system running a preparation protocol based entirely on airborne molecules detected in the nasal cavity. Now, the insulin pre-secretion. Because the anticipatory insulin pulse connects the cephalic phase directly to the glucose management, the post-meal walk, and the chrononutrition discussions described, and the connection means the person who slow cooks has a third glucose management lever. The microwave user does not. Cephalic phase includes a small anticipatory insulin pulse. Beta cells in the pancreas respond to the vagal signal from olfactory input by secreting a modest amount of insulin before any glucose has entered the blood. The pulse is small, far less than a postprandial insulin surge, but it is functionally significant because it primes the insulin signaling cascade. Insulin receptors on muscle cells begin the PI3K, ACT pathway that triggers GLUT4 translocation. The GLUT4 transporters begin mobilizing toward the cell surface. When glucose arrives from digestion minutes or hours later, the glucose clearance machinery is already partially activated. The transporters are closer to the membrane. The signaling cascade is already in motion. The response time is shorter. Teff and colleagues published in the American Journal of Physiology that the cephalic phase insulin response significantly improved postprandial glucose handling. Meals preceded by cephalic phase stimulation produced lower glucose peaks and faster glucose clearance than meals presented without olfactory priming. The glucose arrived at a body that was already clearing it. The curve flattened, not from walking, not from circadian timing, but from the smell of cooking. Chrononutrition discussion describes circadian insulin sensitivity, eating before 2 p.m. when insulin effectiveness is highest. The post-meal walk discussion described contraction, mediated GLUT4 translocation, walking after eating to open the insulin-independent glucose clearance pathway. The cephalic phase insulin pre-secretion is a third mechanism. The GLUT4 machinery priming in advance of glucose arrival through vagal activation from sustained olfactory input. 3 independent glucose management pathways, 3 different inputs, time of day, muscle contraction, olfactory preparation, all additive, all free, all operating through different molecular machinery that does not compete or interfere. Person who slow cooks a meal, eats it before 2 p.m., and walks for 10 minutes afterward has activated 3 glucose clearance mechanisms through 3 different pathways. Circadian insulin sensitivity, ensuring the pancreatic response is at its daily peak. Cephalic phase insulin, pre-secretion, ensuring the GLUT4 machinery is already mobilizing before the glucose arrives. And contraction, mediated GLUT4 translocation, ensuring the insulin-independent clearance door is open during the postprandial window. None requires medication. None requires equipment. None requires clinical intervention. The glucose curve flattens from 3 directions simultaneously, and the person's physician, reviewing the next HbA1c result, sees improvement without being able to attribute it to any single change, because all 3 were operating together. Now, think about the mouth. Because the cephalic phase begins there, and what happens in the mouth determines how efficiently the food is processed downstream. Olfactory input triggers salivary secretion. The parotid, submandibular, and sublingual glands increasing saliva production in response to the smell of cooking food. Saliva is not just lubrication. It is enzymatic preparation. Saliva contains amylase, the enzyme that begins carbohydrate digestion on the tongue, breaking starch into maltose before the food reaches the stomach. Saliva contains lingual lipase, an enzyme secreted from glands at the back of the tongue that initiates fat digestion during chewing, beginning the breakdown of dietary triglycerides before they reach the stomach. Saliva contains mucins, glycoproteins that coat the food bolus during chewing, lubricating it for swallowing and protecting the esophageal mucosa from abrasion and acid during transit. Every component of oral digestion, enzyme activity for carbohydrates, enzyme activity for fats, lubrication for swallowing, protection for the esophagus, is preloaded by the cephalic phase. The mouth is ready before the food arrives. The person who sits down to a slow-cooked meal has a mouth already flooded with amylase-rich, lipase-containing, mucin-coated saliva. The first bite enters a prepared oral environment. Starch digestion begins on contact. Fat digestion begins during chewing. The bolus is lubricated before swallowing. Contrast this with the microwave meal. The mouth that received no olfactory priming. The salivary glands are at baseline output. Amylase and lipase are at basal levels. The first bite must generate the saliva that slow cooking would have preloaded, and the chewing that generates saliva takes time during which the starch and fat in the food are not being enzymatically processed. The oral phase of digestion starts behind and never fully catches up. And then, bile. Bile. The emulsifying fluid produced by the liver and stored in the gallbladder is essential for fat digestion and absorption. Bile salts break dietary fat into small droplets through emulsification, increasing the surface area available for pancreatic lipase to access. Without bile, large fat globules pass through the small intestine undigested. The pancreatic lipase cannot reach the fat molecules buried inside the globule because it can only act at the surface. Emulsification converts one large droplet into thousands of small ones, exposing vastly more surface area to lipase activity. Cephalic phase triggers gallbladder contraction through vagal efferent signaling. The gallbladder begins releasing stored bile into the duodenum before food has left the stomach. When the fatty components of a slow-cooked meal reach the duodenum, bile is already present and emulsification begins immediately upon contact. Fat digestion proceeds without delay. Fatty acids are absorbed efficiently. Fat-soluble vitamins. A, D, E, K, the vitamins, the 65+ viewers physician monitors and often finds deficient, are absorbed in the lipid micelles that bile creates. When food from a meal with no cephalic phase priming reaches the duodenum, bile release must be triggered reactively. The duodenal cells detect the fat, release cholecystokinin, the cholecystokinin reaches the gallbladder through the blood, and the cholecystokinin reaches the gallbladder contracts. The delay is 10 to 15 minutes. During those 15 minutes, fat passes through the proximal duodenum without bile, without emulsification, without efficient lipase access. Some of it reaches the jejunum unprocessed. Some passes further downstream. The fat-soluble vitamins dissolved in that unprocessed fat are lost with it. The vitamins the person may be supplementing to correct a deficiency that the absence of cephalic phase bile preparation could be contributing to. The connection is physiologically coherent. Bile is required for fat-soluble vitamin absorption. The cephalic phase releases bile in advance. Absence of advance. Bile delays emulsification by 10 to 15 minutes. Whether that delay produces clinically measurable malabsorption of supplemental vitamins has not been directly studied. The pathway is plausible. The clinical magnitude is unmeasured. But the direction is consistent. The supplement arrives. The bile may not be there to emulsify it, and the vitamin that required emulsification for absorption passes through the proximal duodenum in an unprocessed fat globule that the intestine cannot absorb. The physician increases the dose. The dose may not have been the problem. The timing of bile release may have been the problem, and the timing depends on whether the nose told the brainstem that fat was coming. That connection. The vitamin D deficiency that persists despite supplementation, because the bile that absorbs the vitamin was not pre-released because the meal arrived without olfactory preparation, is the finding that made the cephalic phase feel like the missing variable in the malabsorption conversation for me. Your kitchen smells like cooking. Your olfactory epithelium is reporting 2 hours of continuously evolving aromatic chemistry to your brainstem. Your brainstem has been running a preparation protocol through the vagus nerve for 2 hours. Acid secreting, enzymes mobilizing, bile flowing, insulin pre-pulsing, saliva loading, motility increasing, absorptive surfaces preparing. The parasympathetic state that the cooking smell sustains has lowered your heart rate, increased your mesenteric blood flow, suppressed your cortisol, and biased your entire autonomic nervous system toward the digestive mode that processes food most efficiently. You sit down. You eat. The food arrives at a system that has been waiting for it. Every organ primed, every enzyme mobilized, every secretion flowing. The meal processes efficiently, completely, comfortably. The food meeting, a digestive tract, that was prepared for exactly this food because the nose spent 2 hours telling the brainstem exactly what was coming. Meal that arrives at an unprepared system. The microwave meal, the delivery meal, the food that appeared without olfactory warning, meets a digestive tract that must start every process from baseline. Acid from zero, enzymes from storage, bile from a resting gallbladder, insulin from an unprimed pancreas, saliva from unstimulated glands. Every process runs 15 to 20 minutes behind. Every process runs 15 to 20 minutes behind. Every downstream consequence of that delay: incomplete protein breakdown, larger food particles in the duodenum, higher osmotic load producing bloating, delayed fat emulsification reducing vitamin absorption, higher glucose peak from the absence of insulin pre-secretion, accumulates across 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. The daily cost is small, the annual cost is not. Person over 65 who switched from home cooking to convenience meals 5 years ago, who microwaves more often, who orders delivery more frequently, who heats pre-prepared food that arrives sealed and scentless, has removed the cephalic phase from hundreds of meals. Each removal was small. The cumulative effect was the gradual onset of the digestive symptoms the person attributes to aging: the bloating, the heaviness, the sense that food does not sit well, the vitamin deficiencies that persist despite supplementation, the postprandial glucose spikes that the physician monitors with increasing concern. Some of this is aging. Some of it is the absence of olfactory preparation from the meals the aging digestive system depended on to compensate for its declining capacitive system depended on to compensate for its declining capacity. The kitchen that smells like cooking is not ambiance. It is not nostalgia. It is not the intangible warmth of a home-cooked meal that marketing language reduces to sentiment. It is a vagal command delivered through the nose, executed by the brainstem, preparing every organ in the digestive tract for what is about to arrive. The smell is the preparation. The preparation is the medicine. And the 2 hours of slow cooking that produce the smell are the dose: 2 hours of sequential Maillard products, caramelization volatiles, and lipid aromatics reaching the olfactory epithelium in an evolving stream that sustains the cephalic phase and maintains the parasympathetic state the body requires to digest the meal the nose has been announcing. Cook slowly. The smell is doing more than you knew.